Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State chat by Joe Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. We usually come to you on Wednesdays, but kind of a late schedule on Thursday, so we're recording Wednesday and publishing Thursday. Hope you're enjoying a great holiday. We're going to be talking about Penn State's place in the college football playoff rankings, the debate about them versus Notre Dame that's been heating up, particularly online, less so, I think, in that committee room and in the polls. Who belongs in that number 4 ranking and ostensibly in the pole position to get the number 6 seed? What do we think of the double standards that seemingly are popping up everywhere with regard to Penn State in the national discourse? Get into a little Tyler Warren chat, whether he belongs in this Heisman Trophy race after another great game at Minnesota. Going to recap that game, too, a little bit. James Franklin's decision to go with the fake punt, and then look forward a little bit to Maryland and the decisions facing James Franklin and this team for this regular season finale. Joel, how are you?
I'm doing well. Glad to be home for Thanksgiving break, get a little bit of relaxation, but not too much, obviously, with everything that's been going on surrounding Penn State recently. So still kind of busy keeping up with the team, but looking forward to it.
Yep, a lot to get to. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments, or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesdays are game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into it. Nicole Auerbach of NBC. I don't mean to single her out. She's not the only person with this opinion, but she did make it, I would say, the most stridently. She said it was, quote, crazy for PSU to continue to be ranked ahead of Notre Dame in the college football playoff rankings. Penn State number 4, Notre Dame number 5. I don't think it's crazy, considering that the committee has done it, and that the preponderance of the Associated Press poll has arrived at that conclusion as well. Certainly, if you look at any individual voter, there are certainly people who have got Penn State down at 7th, 8th. But when you add them all up, all the voters and every the math checks out that Penn State's number 4 in that poll. And I know you have some numbers regarding this debate that just seems to be flaring up between the Nittany Lions and the Fighting Irish, which is relevant because it's basically the difference between possibly facing the ACC champion and Miami and probably the SEC champion, which could be Texas or Georgia. Or Texas A&M in theory. But that could be the difference between who you're facing in the first round or the second round, once you get to the bowl sites. So why don't you tell me what you think and read off some of those numbers that kind of went viral for you, this week.
Yeah. So Nicole put out a tweet, obviously that you referenced, saying that it was basically crazy for Penn State to be ahead of Notre Dame. Obviously, they're number 4 and 5 right now, so it's a pretty close debate. And you could see both sides of the argument, but when you kind of look at the resume, and to me it just kind of comes down to simply the losses. I just don't think you can lose to NIU, and it's not like NIU has gone on to go 11-0 and get ranked or anything like that. NIU is sitting at 6-5, middle of the MAC, unranked. And so obviously that's an embarrassing loss that I think a lot of people are trying to gloss over. There was an earlier tweet from Nicole as well that I also disagreed with, where she basically said the committee has already forgiven Notre Dame for its loss. Now it's time to start rewarding Notre Dame for its wins. And I just don't disagree, or I just don't agree with that at all. I think if the committee had forgiven Notre Dame for that loss to NIU, Notre Dame would probably be 1 or 2 in the country. If you were to take out that loss to NIU and just have, the 10-0 in dominant fashion in all the other games, I think Notre Dame would easily be 1 or 2 up there with Oregon ahead of all those 1 and 2 loss teams. And so I don't think the committee has forgiven that loss at all. So I guess that's kind of where I disagree with her. And like you said, I don't mean to single her out specifically, because there's been a lot of other people who have kind of held that same argument and had that same standpoint. But she's been probably the most vocal about it. And it's also interesting that, kind of she's the one that's spearheading this case. Obviously, she works for NBC, which owns the media rights to Notre Dame, but she's also the Big Ten insider for NBC. And so you would think if anyone was, kind of qualified to speak on the relevance of Notre Dame and Penn State within the rankings, she would probably have a good grasp on it. And, I can get into the numbers. Obviously, they have the same record. Penn State's losses to number 2 Ohio State by 7 points. Notre Dame lost to NIU, currently unranked. And if you look at strength of schedule, Penn State's 32, Notre Dame is 78. Strength of record, which is, how you performed against that schedule, Penn State's number 4, Notre Dame's number 10. Those are some of the key metrics that the committee has said it uses when determining things. And then if you want to look at ranked wins, Penn State has the win over number 23 Illinois, and Notre Dame has a win over number 20 Texas A&M. So obviously pretty similar wins there. Obviously Texas A&M is slightly above Illinois in the rankings, but when you also look at how those games went, Penn State beat Illinois 21-7 pretty comfortably. I think people forget if they're just looking at the box score. Penn State missed 2 field goals in that game. I think they were both shorter as well, like 40 or less. And so Penn State could have won that game 27-7, which obviously looks and sounds a lot better than 21-7. So I think Penn State was in control of that game. Obviously, Illinois came out on the first drive and scored a touchdown. After that was pretty much shut down. So I would say Penn State dominated number 23 Illinois, whereas Notre Dame's only ranked win. And they have, wins over teams that were ranked at the time, but going off where teams are currently ranked, which I think is the best way to do it. Notre Dame's only ranked win is Texas A&M, and that was a game that was tied in the fourth quarter, and Notre Dame had to pull away late to win by 10 points. And so I think Penn State's ranked win, Illinois might be slightly lower than Texas A&M in the rankings, but Penn State also won in a more dominant fashion. And even Penn State's loss to Ohio State, I think, can help Penn State's argument because, you could argue that it was a very close game, which, tells you that Penn State should be right up there near Ohio State in the rankings, which they are. But I mean, there's so many different ways you can look at it. And I've heard a lot of different arguments in response to that tweet that I put out. And I've been trying to kind of respond to them. I've maybe gotten a little bit too far into the weeds at this point. I might have to back away a little bit, but there's certainly, some interesting debates going on right now. But I think, people are kind of overthinking it. And to put it simply, both teams are 11-1. Notre Dame has a very embarrassing loss, and Penn State's loss is one of the best losses that you can have.
Yeah, I think another thing Nicole pointed out was that Notre Dame is number 1 in the country in game control, and that's fine. If you want to pick Notre Dame in a hypothetical game against Penn State, I don't think that's really the argument. And something I've appreciated about Nicole is that she's made a lot of great points about how the games have to matter when talking about the disparity between Indiana and some of these when they were still 2-loss SEC teams and whether Indiana should get dropped below them, and even in the context of 3-loss. There's still SEC fans arguing 3-loss teams should be ranked ahead of Indiana. And she made a great point, which is what I agree with, is that the games need to count. It can't just be we can't just put it 1 through 12 in the playoff, who Vegas thinks is the most likely to win the national championship. If they were just ranked 1 to 12, it has to be based on the results on the field. I just think if you're going to make that point, with regard to the SEC and the Big Ten, the same thing should stand for Penn State against Notre Dame in this case. And I agree with you. They've forgiven the NIU loss in other contexts when compared to other teams. But I think when you're comparing these two specific teams, it is the big thing that is separating them. Although just I appreciate Nicole's work a lot, and I think she's one of the most prominent people making this argument. So that's why we're talking about her. But I've gotten some other people written down here who've made some level of argument that the wins and losses just don't matter to them. Who do I have? Chris Vanini of The Athletic compared Penn State's close win to Bowling Green with Notre Dame's loss to NIU, basically calling them equivalent things. Matt Zemek, I believe he covers USC. He said last week that he thought Penn State and Indiana played equivalent games, even though Penn State beat Minnesota and Indiana lost to Ohio State. Where is this double standard coming from, Joel? Because have you ever seen that drill tweet? I've been retweeting it a couple times now, where it's a little profane. So you can look it up on my Twitter at FujiMaster24. But basically, the drill tweet says, there's really no different. The wise man said, there's no difference between good things and bad things, you idiot. And that just seems like how a lot of people are talking about Penn State right now is they're acting like there's no difference between wins and losses when comparing their resume to other people. And it's because I think there's this label on them that they can't win the big game, which is entirely fair. And again, once we get to the playoff, if you want to tell me that James Franklin and this team is going to choke because of past precedent, I don't particularly have a problem with that argument. But there can't be like a different set of rules for Penn State because it hasn't won that big game in a handful of years, and a different set of rules for everyone they're being compared to, right, Joel?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And, you could even ask Penn State fans right now, how confident are you in Penn State's ability to win a big game? They're probably not very confident, but at the end of the day, you have to look at, which teams are most deserving, especially this year. You can't, be basing it on, Penn State shortcomings in larger games over the past few years. If you want to, point to the Ohio State game this year, sure, but that's an Ohio State team that might win the national championship this year. And Penn State was, right there at the goal line with the chance to tie the game in the fourth quarter, at whatever, the 1 yard line, 4th and 1, and couldn't, convert. And, obviously that game could have easily gone the other way. And, at a certain point, you have to say Penn State, continues to struggle against these elite teams, but they're also right there in the game every time. And if Penn State gets a few different bounces a few of these times, Penn State could easily win one of those games. I think it's also important to note that for this Notre Dame Penn State argument, for anyone who's saying that it doesn't really matter who's 4 and who's 5, I think it makes a huge difference when you're projecting out the final bracket, because Penn State as of now, which obviously the rankings probably won't hold, and we'll still have conference championship games and things like that, but Penn State as of right now would be hosting Indiana in the first round for the chance to play Miami in the Peach Bowl. And I tend to believe Penn State would be favored in both of those games. I've seen Penn State hypothetically as an 8.5 point favorite over Indiana. Feels about right to me. And obviously, those are two teams that are pretty familiar with each other, and Penn State historically has been pretty dominant against Indiana. So that's kind of, that's kind of a dream matchup for Penn State at this point. And then obviously the second round matchup against Miami. Miami's obviously got a pretty talented roster, and they're sitting at 10-1 as well. It's a good team, but they have the one embarrassing loss, and I don't know if they have necessarily any really marquee wins. And so I think if you're Penn State, you like your chances against Miami as well to kind of make it into the semifinals before things really get tricky. And I think if you look at Notre Dame's schedule, I believe they would have to play like Tennessee and Georgia or something like that in order to make it through to the semifinals. And if you were to flip those two teams, obviously it would be the reverse. And I think if you're Penn State, you have a much more favorable.
Actually, Joel, right now, Notre Dame is in that 7th spot. So they get SMU in the first round, and then they would face Texas, which kind of leads in well to my next question of, regardless, it really seems like the important distinction, I think, what do you think is more important? Let me ask it this way: that Penn State stay in that 6th seed and have a chance to play Miami in the bowl game? Because I think you can make the same critique of Texas, right? Is that they've kind of played a similarly soft schedule, even though they're in the SEC, did play Georgia, but lost to them rather convincingly. Does it super matter to you whether they play Miami or Texas, or is the big game just to stay out of that 8th spot? Where right now you have, probably on the left side of the bracket right now, you have Georgia, Oregon, and Ohio State. I think to me, it's less a matter of whether you're 6 or 7 in the seeding versus Notre Dame, and more to just stay out of that 8th spot and not end up on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point. And, things could get shuffled again to the point where, we don't have Ohio State, Oregon, Georgia on the same side of the bracket. But yeah, if you're Penn State, I think opponent 100% matters. Obviously you want to be able to, play the easiest schedule possible. And eventually, obviously at some point you'll have to play, one of those elite teams in order to actually, make it to the national championship and win it. But, you want the easiest path possible. And, there's obviously a few reasons to that. I mean, you could argue how big of a win it would be for Penn State to beat Indiana in the playoffs. I mean, I would consider it a big win. There are probably some people who wouldn't, just because of, Penn State's history against Indiana. It would almost just feel like kind of another, regular season game that the two have played so many of. But, I would consider that a pretty big game. And then to kind of have to be able to kind of build momentum and confidence off that win, going into the second round against Miami on a neutral site, and to have a pretty good shot of winning that one as well, I think is important. I think the draw makes a huge difference, because these other teams on the other side of the bracket are going to be kind of beating each other up. And, obviously some of them are going to have to lose before they get a chance to make it to the championship, but also even the teams that win, just the attrition that you go through from playing, against other elite teams, whether that's, injuries or just kind of the physical wear that it has on your body. Obviously the schedules are longer than they've ever been in the past because of the playoff. Teams are going to play more games than they've ever played before. And that's going to take a toll. And Penn State's also a team that's kind of been dealing with some injuries recently. And so, kind of the easier path you can get, the better it is, in terms of just making it, farther into the bracket while remaining healthy, which I think is an important thing to balance.
Yeah, and I guess we should point out, just to wrap up this point, that Penn State, if they fell to the 7th seed and Georgia wins the SEC championship game theoretically against Texas or Texas A&M, that's a battle-tested team that you'd be facing in Penn State. So then there is a big difference between being 6 and being 7, and the path that it would take to get to the semifinals. So, I think that's why it's important that Penn State goes out and has a good showing against Maryland. And maybe you hope that all of the bad juju that's been going against USC all season that helped Penn State in that win in Los Angeles back in October maybe balances out a little bit for the Trojans, and they beat Notre Dame to make that a moot point. Joel, I want to switch gears here to Tyler Warren. PJ Fleck was very effusive in his praise of Tyler Warren this week. There's been a lot of people pushing online, saying Tyler Warren should be in this Heisman Trophy conversation, given what a unique player he is. And if uniqueness is, kind of the foundation of Travis Hunter's case to win, then why shouldn't Tyler Warren be in that same conversation as a really versatile guy on multiple offensive positions? What do you think in terms of where, Tyler Warren belongs in this conversation? I actually think Ashton Jeanty is the most scintillating player in college football. I've had a lot of Boise games on. For those of you that don't know, I got like a 3 TV setup in my basement. So oftentimes Boise is one of the 3 biggest games that I'm keeping an eye on. And, every time I look up, he's turning out Saquon Barkley-like runs. So he would be my pick to win the Heisman Trophy as of today. But Joel, just give me a read on Tyler Warren and how he should stack up with some of these top contenders in your mind.
Yeah, well, Jeanty's been awesome to watch, obviously, and playing in the Mountain West, they get that late time zone where you finish all the 7 p.m. games and you're flipping through the channels to find something that's still on, and there's Boise State, so I think that almost benefits him in a way because you're able to get eyes on them. And I think there was a stretch earlier in the season where Boise State played like 3 straight Friday night games or something like that, and so people were kind of able to get a lot of eyes on him, and he's been able to build up kind of that hype. I think if I was a voter, he would have my vote, at least as of right now, barring something crazy happening. But as far as Tyler Warren at least being in the conversation, I think he's definitely deserving. On3 does their Heisman poll among their staff, among their football writers, and Tyler Warren was number 5 this week, which he's slowly climbed up. He went from not being on the list to being toward the bottom, now up to number 5, and obviously 3 finalists will end up in New York. And I think if you're Warren, best case scenario at this point is probably to hope for a trip to New York. I don't think he can win this one unless something crazy happens here down the stretch. But I think he also had a few games earlier in the season where Penn State, and this wasn't his fault at all, but I think Penn State didn't necessarily know how to use him, how to utilize his skill set and things like that at the start of the season. So obviously his numbers are a little bit lower because of that. I think one knock on him might be that, Harold Fannin is putting up better numbers than him, at least through the passing game. And people aren't going to really dig deep into, let's add up passing and rushing yards and whatever, or I should say receiving and rushing yards together. And I think, just on the surface level, people are going to see that he's not statistically the best receiving tight end because of the crazy numbers that Harold Fannin is putting up. I think that hurts his case a little bit. But so, even in the race for the Mackey, it'll be tight. I think Tyler Warren will win that Mackey Award for the best tight end in college football. I think that's, I think he's very much the front runner for that right now in kind of a 2-horse race. And But yeah, to turn to the Heisman, I think if you're Tyler Warren, you're just hoping to at least be a finalist, which is obviously a big honor to be. But I don't think anyone's going to be able to catch Jeanty at this point, especially with kind of the slower start that Warren had.
Yeah, going to be interesting to see how, not just the Heisman shakes out, but you mentioned the Mackey Award. That'd be a nice honor for him for the season that he's had if you're not invited to New York. So definitely going to keep an eye on that. Joel, let's go rapid fire here with some quick conversation about the Minnesota game. I'll start with the fake punt. What did you think of the call? A lot of people thought it was gutsy. I thought that they should just line up and go for it. And I was thinking back to that 2019 game at Minnesota, where Minnesota, you just know the PJ Fleck wants to ball control the heck out of you. And I think if you had punted the ball back to him in that situation, Penn State would not have gotten the ball back with any time, because that is where, PJ Fleck makes his meals, in my opinion. So in that context, I don't know how, I'm surprised that the fake worked, because I would have thought that would have been the first thing that PJ Fleck said to his guys of there's no way they're kicking this back to us now, right? You got to keep an eye on the fake. So in that context, it worked. You got it right. But I actually think I might have just lined up and gone for it, knowing how these games with Minnesota have gone in the past.
Well, I think that skepticism from Minnesota might just be due to kind of Penn State's track record under Franklin of being very conservative with the football. Even early in that game, Penn State's first two drives resulted in, 4th and 1s where they ended up punting. And, you could have argued that they should have gone for either or both of those. I get it. It was early in the game, but, again, a 4th and 1, I think, you should be confident in your ability to convert there. Penn State also had a failed 4th down earlier in the game. And then there was obviously the special teams miscues with, the block punts, things like that. So there were just a ton of factors going into it. But I think James Franklin's track record, he's known for not being aggressive in those types of situations. And I think if you're Minnesota, you're kind of basing on that, you maybe expect, okay, maybe this is a punt. And so I think that played into it. And then as far as just the actual play call itself, it was interesting because we got to talk to Franklin after the game, obviously. And he talked about that specific play that they've been working on it, since summer camp. It's kind of been in their back pocket. He actually said they've called the play about 6 times this season, and just have never been able to actually run it because Dom Ruley, who acts as kind of the personal protector for Luke Reynolds on the play, kind of, scopes out the defense, sees what alignment they're in and what kind of personnel they have on the field. And then based on kind of the numbers, he decides whether to check out of the play or not. And every other time this season, they've actually checked out of that play. And so if Minnesota brings out different personnel for that play or lines up, in a different alignment and Dom Rowley doesn't like what he sees, Penn State's not running that play, which I thought was kind of a really interesting thing to learn after the game. And we got to talk to a few of the guys afterwards as well, who were kind of surprised, almost excited. I got to talk to Dom DeLuca about it, who was kind of involved in that play as well. And, he said it was hard not to almost false start because he was so excited that, oh my God, we're actually going to run this play. And, he knew it was coming. And then obviously they executed it pretty much perfectly, results in a 32-yard run. So they got more than they needed to close out the game there. So I would say it was a very controlled aggression. I don't know if it was, a super aggressive play just because they had the option to check out of it. And they knew, heading into it, we're only going to run this play if we have a numbers advantage and, we have the extra blockers and we feel confident in running it. So even when Franklin is being aggressive, it's, only semi-aggressive because it's very dependent and, they have the ability to not run that play if they don't like what they see.
I also think the use of Luke Reynolds was important. I think he's kind of we're having these conversations about Tyler Warren. Man, that kid's a good athlete and he's only a freshman and his ability to make that play, maybe they were a lot more confident for that reason because they've got a guy who you can trust to pick up 32 yards, let alone just get one. Joel, any concern about Kayton Allen? They brought it up on the broadcast that he didn't see, I think it was the whole first half, he didn't see a carry, was not particularly efficient when he did get in there. Any concern about him? Because obviously things have been trending in the right direction with Nick Singleton, but Kayton Allen's the other part of that two-headed beast. What are your thoughts on the situation with him?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting, and I don't think we ever got any actual clarification about why he wasn't used. We got to halftime, and he didn't have any carries, and Singleton obviously wasn't having a great game up until that point. I forget the exact, I think he had like 6 carries for 15 yards in the first half, something like that. So Penn State was obviously struggling in the ground game and probably could have used Kaytron. But we didn't see him at all in the first half. I had people texting me as I'm in the press box, what's wrong with Kaytron? Is he out there? And I'm trying to look for him on the sidelines and things like that. But then obviously coming out of halftime, Kaytron hopped on the bike on the sidelines, and then went out there, got the first carry of the second half, took it for 8 yards, looked fine. After that, and obviously the yards per carry weren't anything crazy, but he played and appeared to be okay, at least from what we could tell. So I don't know if there's too much concern there based on what we were able to see from him in the second half. I think maybe it was just that he didn't factor too much into the game plan early on, just because Penn State, I think, maybe wanted to air the ball out, or maybe they just weren't able to get enough first down conversions to actually get enough snaps to kind of cycle him in. Because again, Singleton, I think, only got 6 carries in that first half, and none for Kaytron. So there just weren't kind of a lot of touches to go around. That could be the thing, but yeah, I don't believe Franklin ever made any comment on that afterward. And from what we saw in the second half, I think he was okay. So I would anticipate that he'll be fine moving forward. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer for you there, because I don't think anyone ended up asking about it. But just based on what we saw in the second half, and there's always the chance that it was potentially a disciplinary thing where Franklin got mad at him for something and told him he would have to sit the first half. But we'll never really know the answer to that.
Joel, what'd you think about the pass rush? I had some moments there where I felt like I was watching the Steelers for Thursday night, where there was constant pressure seemingly on the quarterback, but they really struggled to get home. And I think it played a big role in Minnesota being able to stay in that game. It felt like the Golden Gophers were on the other side of midfield for the entire game. It'd be like they'd hit one pass and they'd be there. Are you concerned at all about the pass rush? Are you more encouraged that they were getting the amount of pressure that they were, or discouraged that they weren't getting home?
I think I would tend to be encouraged based on those results. Obviously, you always want to finish when you can get into the backfield, and you want to bring down the quarterback and rack up those tackles for loss and things like that. They did get to him, to Brosmer, a couple times, and for the most part, they bottled up Darius Taylor pretty well. We obviously saw how shifty Taylor was for Minnesota. Made a lot of guys miss, but he also kind of a lot of times got bottled up or even went backwards and lost yardage trying to get around guys. And I thought Penn State did a really good job in the run defense as well. But in terms of pressure, I think you always want as many pressures as you can get. You're not always gonna get home, dependent on a lot of other factors, including how quickly Brosmer's getting the ball out of his hand. Obviously, if he doesn't give you enough time to get there, then there's not much you can do. But if you're consistently getting into the backfield like that, and that's not the first time Penn State's been able to do that. I think against Washington, it was against Washington, where Washington had 25 pass attempts and Penn State registered like 26 pressures on the quarterback, because I think one of them didn't even end up as a pass attempt or something like that, which was kind of a ridiculous stat, that they had like more pressures than actual passes from Washington. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the ability to just get into the backfield, that obviously says that they're capable of getting there. Obviously, they should probably be finishing at a higher rate, but the fact that they're even able to get in the backfield like that consistently against a decent offensive line for Minnesota, I think is still pretty promising. And if they get home on a few more, we're obviously talking about kind of how dominant they could have been, I guess. But yeah, I think as long as they can just continue to kind of apply that pressure, get into the backfield, I think the numbers will follow. Assuming they can finish, I don't think there's any sort of issue in that regard.
What do you take away from another close win on the road from this team? So that's 3 this year with the USC and Wisconsin wins. You trail in the second half, you come back and win. Is it a sign of weakness at all to you? As some people, going back to our earlier conversation about the playoffs, are portraying those narrow wins as weakness? Because again, it's such a double standard to me. Because if they dominate those teams, we get told how bad the teams that they're playing are. If they win narrowly on the road, they're weak because they didn't dominate those teams. It's kind of a no-win situation in the discourse for Penn State. But how do you assess that? I look at it and say that if you told me Penn State was going to play such 3 narrow games on the road against these teams, historically, they don't win all of them. They slip up in at least one of them, and that ends up defining the season. You think about, the 2019 trip to Minnesota. You think about what Michigan State in 2017 basically ended that season. So it hasn't always been Michigan and Ohio State that have ended Penn State's, playoff bids. It's been some of these off the board teams. If you want to go back even further, that loss to Iowa in 2008, that probably cost them a slot in the national championship. The loss to a not so great Michigan team in 2005. I think it says a lot about this team that they've, with one game to go at home, they have gotten the job done in these games.
Yeah. I think first of all, winning is always important, and winning matters. I think that's the most important statistic to look at when you're evaluating a team. Regardless of what some people in the media might say, wins do matter. It is important to actually win those games that you play. That being said, I do think there is some cause for concern. These are teams that, while they might be decent opponents, they're not, on that kind of elite tier. I mean, Penn State kind of definitely considers itself as being above these teams, and to be, especially the Minnesota one, I think stands out to me a little bit more than the others. But all of them, none of them are necessarily a great look. I do think you have to take that into consideration that Penn State could have lost these games if a few things go against Penn State. I think you could probably say the same thing about Ohio State, where Penn State maybe could have won that game if a few things go differently. But at the same time, when you keep playing these close games, that's when you start getting called fraudulent and things like that, because of an inability to put away these teams. I do think it is a little bit concerning. You probably would have, if you're Penn State, you probably would have wanted to win in a more convincing fashion and not really leave any doubt. But at the same time, I think there's something to the ability to come back and win late in these games when you need to, almost that clutch factor, that, you can't really quantify it, but I don't think any previous Penn State teams have had it, at least since, I've been following the team. And I think this team just kind of has that clutch factor. They have that confidence. I think you could attribute part of it to Kotelnicki and what he's done, part of it to, some of the guys on the team, like Tyler Warren and his ability to seemingly always come through when the team needs him. Things like that. So I think it is important to have that experience that, you can come back in the fourth quarter, where if Penn State gets into one of these playoff games and it's a tight game, late in the game, you have that confidence and that you have the ability to come back. Might not always work that way. You might not, keep being able to escape in these games, and it ultimately might bite you. But I do think it's good experience to have, even if those games don't necessarily look great on paper.
Looking to Maryland this week, Joel, how soon are you pulling Drew Allar, Nick Singleton, Tyler Warren? Would you consider pulling them before halftime if you're up 2 or 3 scores, just to keep them preserved for this playoff run? Or is that too big a risk to take that, this Terps team, this is probably one of their Super Bowls every year, that if you let them get back in the game, you end up in an unnecessary dogfight?
Yeah. I obviously wouldn't want to jinx it by, calling for a first half, benching of Allar or whatever, and then it ends up being a tight game on Saturday or anything like that. But this is a Maryland team that's struggling. I think they've lost 6 of the last 7. Ironically, the only win was against USC in that stretch for Maryland. But this is a team that, lost 4 straight. They just picked up their 7th loss, which means, they can't even make a bowl game at this point unless something wonky happens and they're 5-7 and their academic rate is high enough to get in or whatever. But, at this point, I think there's not much to play for. Making a bowl game isn't super important for some teams like Penn State, but at a school like Maryland, making a bowl game isn't necessarily a given. And so, even when you pick up a few losses, there's still something to fight for. But at this point, they're now on a big losing streak and they're, kind of out of bowl eligibility. I don't know how much there really is to play for. Now you have to go on the road to Beaver Stadium where you've never really had success before. I think Maryland might come out flat in this one, and Penn State should be able to pull away pretty quickly. I would certainly consider taking the starters out, maybe at halftime, if you feel comfortable with how you're playing. And this is probably a team where even once Penn State puts its backups in, should still be able to have, somewhat good control over the game and not all of a sudden fall apart and start struggling. You do have to be a little bit careful about that, because like we saw when Penn State went to Purdue, they started pulling their starters really quickly. It was the third drive, Purdue's third drive, where Penn State was putting in backups on defense, and all of a sudden Purdue marches down the field And I forget if they got a touchdown or field goal on that drive, but regardless, it was one of their best drives of the day. And all of a sudden, the next drive, the starters are back out. So I think, you can certainly jump the gun if you're not careful. So you definitely want to have this game put away. There's also an interesting thing to think about of, does Penn State want to run up the score, leave its starters in to make its resume look better, especially when you're, because Notre Dame fans are going to be coming in. And if Penn State maybe pulls its starters and the game ends up being, a 2-score game, something like that, you might hear some backlash from people who didn't even watch the game who are saying that, Penn State didn't dominate or something like that. So there's always something like that to be worried about. But if it's me, I think you've already dealt with enough injuries this season that you want to try and take the starters out as soon as, you feel comfortable, even if that's at halftime.
Yeah, any of these injuries that you're eyeing here, as we go into this last week, and then we're probably likely talking about the playoffs.
Yeah, there's a ton of guys, and Franklin's never been super clear about who's out, how long they're out for, etc. Even going back to the beginning of the year, a guy like Kevin Winston Jr., who was announced as out for the long term, but not out for the season necessarily. Which he might be out for the season, he might not be. We just don't know, but he was a long-term injury that was sustained very early in the season that I think a lot of people have almost forgot about him and kind of what he was able to do and how he was projected as a first-round pick. That was a big loss for Penn State. There's the potential for him to come back, which is huge, but you look at some other key positions and a lot of it is guys who have kind of gotten banged up, missed some time, but kind of come back into the lineup and gone back and forth. Like Nick Singleton obviously missed the UCLA game. I did talk to him after last Saturday's game against Minnesota, and Nick said he was fine. He said he was back to 100% for the rest of the year, which I think is a good thing. But like you brought up earlier, Kaytron, we're not 100% sure if he has something going on there or not. And then Anthony Donko is a big one, I think, at right tackle. I believe that was confirmed as long-term this week by James Franklin, which is obviously a pretty big deal. And you never want to have a tackle go down, and that's an offensive line that's already dealt with some guys moving around. JB Nelson's gone down. Venga, I think, has gone down as well. And even if some of these guys are returning, it's still, there's a lot of pieces shuffling around, and Penn State's really going to get tested. I think that offensive line specifically is an area of concern for Penn State, where right now, I think even without Donko, you kind of feel confident with the guys in the room because you can bring in Cooper Cousins at, center guard and move some other guys around if you need to. But if, one more guy goes down, then, you're really starting to question kind of the integrity of that offensive line. So I would say specifically offensive line, but even at some other positions, there are some injuries that Penn State's definitely been hurt by this season.
Are you interested to see what the student buy-in this week is with, obviously there's a playoff berth on the line, but, historically the students don't rush back to campus for this game after Thanksgiving. Are you looking at it as a potential barometer of how many are going to show up for a playoff game? Because listen, a lot of students, Penn State's not what it was in the 1980s anymore, where it's like a Philly, Pittsburgh type of school, and a lot of people are in state. You've got people from all over the region who may not be able to either get back or stay until 5 days before Christmas. What's your read on what, will you be curious to see what the crowd looks like this week? And if it's not great, are you going to be worried at all that this atmosphere we've been talking about so much, a playoff whiteout in Happy Valley, having an SEC team have to come in here and face that maybe the holidays will take a little bit of steam out of it?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. And obviously, since it's never actually happened before, we really don't have anything to kind of reference. I don't think the showing will be great for this Maryland game, but, even this Maryland game, you could consider it a playoff game because if Penn State loses, there's talks of, potentially getting bumped out of the bracket. So, this is kind of a win and you're in situation for Penn State, at least in my mind. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of, how the students do. Obviously, coming off of Thanksgiving break, it's never really a great showing there. And I don't think, Maryland generates that much buzz from people in terms of rushing back. But as far as the playoff game, I think it'll be a completely different animal. I think, regardless of the situation, regardless of, people's plans, if they have, a flight booked to go home, or if they're coming from, whatever state it may be, if it's, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, wherever, I think people will be there. I think that's one of those games that you just don't want to miss no matter what. I think Penn State made a smart decision by keeping their dorms open until the Sunday after that game, so that anyone who's living on campus can stay there for an extra day. and be able to go to that game. Which I think a lot of people will take advantage of that if they're living on campus. And then obviously if you're living in an apartment, you have it the whole year, so you can stay until whenever. But I think people will be there. I think it's too big of an event for people to pass up. And I just think Penn State fans, this is one of the biggest games in Beaver State. You could argue it's the biggest game, in Beaver Stadium ever, just because it's, the first playoff game in Beaver Stadium. I think it'll be packed no matter what. I think we'll potentially be looking at an attendance record, regardless of break or not. I just tend to believe that, people aren't going to want to miss this one, regardless of, where they're coming from, how their plans are, what kind of things they have to switch around. I think they'll make time for it.
Yeah, you referenced we don't have a ton of data on this kind of situation for Penn State because usually they've blown it before this. But 2016, it sticks in my mind when they had a chance to make the Big Ten championship game. I believe if Ohio State beat Michigan in that one, which they did. And in my mind's eye, that game was packed. Even Michigan State was a pretty good team, so I think that probably helped, that particular year. But people did come back after Thanksgiving and waited to, hear what the result was from I believe that game was in Ann Arbor. I remember the cheers going around in that one. So I think that if that's the closest bellwether for what we have, I think you're going to see maybe a better than average crowd this week with better than the average, after Thanksgiving crowd this week against Maryland. And I tend to agree that the people are going to show up for the playoff game. But hey, it is interesting to ponder because we are in somewhat uncharted territory. But Joel, thanks for joining me. Everyone else, I think we already wished you a happy Thanksgiving, but thank you for making our podcast part of your day. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the game this weekend. Joel will be back on the Post-Gazette Sports Now YouTube channel, recapping whatever goes on against Maryland. So make sure you're subscribed. And if you enjoyed this video, please pop a like on the like button. Always helps us out in the YouTube algorithm. We appreciate that. And otherwise, we will be talking to you next week, possibly about either a Penn State Big Ten championship game berth, if things fall the right way, or a likely potential playoff berth.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.